And now let's dive into the part of the video I worked the most on, Furina and double hydro teams. When Neuvillette was first released in 4.1 and even the patch later with the arrival of Furina, many players were convinced that without Neuvillette C1, double hydro teams were a guaranteed team damage loss. If you wanted to play Furina with Neuvillette without coping, you needed Neuvillette C1. I've strongly disagreed of course, and eventually new evidence, gameplays and Fury crafting convinced players that not only double hydro has its merits, but that Furina is an amazing teammate even for C0 Neuvillette. Many think the best Neuvillette teams all have Furina actually. But why were people initially so skeptical? Well, first of all, bringing only 2 elements other than Hydro in your team means getting only 2 Draconic stacks out of 3, which is a massive damage loss. In fact, the 3rd Draconic stack is a 28% damage increase on Neuvillette's charge attacks, so overall a total 23-24% damage increase. Of course, even with C0, Neuvillette can get all 3 stacks in a double Hydro team by reacting with auras provided by the enemies, which is basically the equivalent of having C1. But that's not guaranteed to happen, and in many scenarios it's just impossible because the enemies just don't have other elements. In that case, double hydro teams are a trade. You lose a draconic stack, which is a massive amount of personal damage, but in return you get something else. What exactly? Hydro Resonance by itself is about a 10-12% damage increase, which is nice, but not even close to 24. So your Hydro teammate needs to bring in something else to make the trade worth it. Furina's damage bonus buff is usually around a 17-23% damage increase overall. Mona's Omen provides a significant amount of damage bonus, but only for a few seconds, so overall she's roughly between an 8-10% damage increase, but it can be more if the fight ends very early. C2 Xincho is an underrated free-to-play option who provides 15% resistance shred, so with a VV user is usually about only 6.5% damage increase. But he also provides strong interruption resistance, which is useful against very aggressive enemies. His damage reduction is nice too, but generally not that valuable for Neuvillette. Finally, a very competitive option for speedrunning and even more competitive than Furina is Child, whose passive provides 5.6% damage increase, which isn't a lot, but his most valuable asset is that he provides the buff with full uptime just by existing, without ever needing to go on field nor even being built, just being there naked is enough. It might not sound that impressive considering the buff is not that great, but when you can speedrun a chamber in, 12 seconds, then even a couple of seconds make a gigantic difference. So, the numbers I just gave you describe the strength of the respective buffs, but one thing these numbers won't tell you is the other reason why having a second Hydro teammate is so important. The off-field application is extremely useful and comfortable. The biggest problem of solo Hydro teams is reacting with certain elements and characters in order to unlock the buffs, and since Neuvillette has zero off-field Hydro application, that can become quite hard sometimes, especially when you need to refresh effects like VV mid-rotation. The most frustrating part is that some rotations and setups will or will not work depending on your ping or the way the ICD of some attacks and reactions work. For example, when I made this short video on a Neuvillette free-to-play team, I initially wanted to include only 3 characters, but Lisa's Burst and Electrocharge would tick in such a way that half of the times I wasn't able to get a Hydro swirl mid-rotation, even if I applied Hydro right before swapping to Lynette. Since I wasn't able to swirl consistently, for the video I replaced Lisa with Fischl and only briefly mentioned Lisa just to make you know she was technically viable. So if you try solo Hydro in an Electrocharge team, you will often experience the reaction ticking and consuming Hydro just an instant before your Anemo attack connects, and it genuinely sucks. That's why I was so excited I could use Mona with Neuvillette in 4.1, and that Furina was such a great teammate, even if you couldn't get 3 Draconic stacks, but also discovering Xincho is a viable free-to-play option. Off-field Hydro just feels amazing, guarantees easier and reliable refreshing of your buffs, and you don't need to rely on very low ping or Hydro absorptions from your Anemo character, like I did with Lynette here. And that's why Furina is so good with Neuvillette. You get all these perks, and on top of that she gives you off-field damage and buffs strong enough to compensate for a Draconic stack lost. That's a pretty convenient trade. Okay, so Furina, even if Neuvillette is C0, is still really good, gotcha. But how good exactly? And how much better than similar teams without her? Is it enough to justify the cost of pulling for her or using her with Neuvillette instead of your other Abyss team? Also, wouldn't you need to bring a healer to maximize the fanfare stacks? How impactful would the healing from Prototype Ember be? What are the best teams with Furina? You will know these and much else very soon. To be honest, this video is also meant to be the final form of some analysis I made a long time ago on Neuvillette and Furina teams. In this post that I wrote a while after Furina's release, I compared 3 Neuvillette teams in order to communicate 2 main points. 1. Furina with C0 Neuvillette is a competitive option even when facing one of the best Rainbow teams, and she can surpass them, which is something very well known today. And 2. Furina with Neuvillette doesn't need healers. The team can even perform better without one. Both of these points at the time were quite controversial, the latter somewhat even today, and honestly I can't blame them. Like, imagine not only losing a massive amount of damage by giving up a draconic stack in order to fit Furina in the team, but also not using a healer to maximize Furina's own potential. And then someone comes to you and says that, oh, but believe me, it's actually a great deal, I swear. It sounds like complete bullshit, let's be honest. But I had looked at the map and watched gameplays, and it seemed like it was actually objectively true. So I made more calculations to understand why it was so, and when I was sure of what was going on, I decided to share the knowledge with the community. But I fear that it wasn't convincing enough, so in my final analysis I did something which is the main reason why I've never been satisfied with those calcs, and I've never made a video on them until now. See, calculating Neuvillette and Furina teams with traditional spreadsheets is a mess. Not just because of how hard it is to keep track of Furina's fanfare stacks, but because Neuvillette is a polihedrically broken character. What the hell does that mean? I mean that he doesn't just have high numbers, survivability, the best element in the game, cutting, range, and ridiculous AoE consolidation, just to mention a few, but he's also very disgustingly flexible. By that, I mean that he can not only play a huge variety of teams, but with each one of them he can perform many different rotations and he can easily adapt to any scenario, which means that he can distribute his damage in very different ways according to the situation, and min-maxing his rotations leads to almost endless possibilities. But why am I telling you all of this? Well, because calculations, even when the math is correct, are always somewhat wrong, in the sense that they describe a model which uses certain assumptions, and to understand the calcs, it's important to know those assumptions and what they do. Back to my old calcs, not exactly sure of what context would have been all the most balanced, practical and objective. In order to be convincing, I eventually established some assumptions that were significantly biased against the very points I was trying to demonstrate, so that my points, still standing true even in an unfavorable scenario, would make the conclusions more credible. Basically, I shoot myself in the foot so that if I were still able to walk, I just couldn't be dismissed by people not wanting to believe me. For the Furina teams, I put in the main graphs the rotations after the first one. That's much better for the healer teams because they can build more fanfare stacks faster, while it's much worse for the non-healer teams because with the characters already half dead, Furina loses a significant amount of damage, and you also get less stacks from the HP draining. The most biased team though was the Rainbow one with Fischl. Not only I used a double sword setup that's often unpractical and can't be repeated 2 rotations in a row because of odds interfering, but in the damage calculations I assumed 2 full odd summons even though the rotation abruptly ends before odds can finish his pew pew. This considerably inflates the DPS calculations, and looking at it today I seriously think it was too much, even though I warned about it in the post itself, but still many people didn't read the whole post and just took a look at the graphs. Still, even after all of these, the Furina Kazuha Zhongli team in the old calcs performed great, which apparently convinced many players that Furina was actually quite good with Neuvillette, even at C0. I'm not totally sure of how many people I reached, but if you search on Google Neuvillette Furina calcs, the first result is actually my Reddit post, so that's also why I need to update the calcs, because now the tides have changed and my calcs seriously risk to mislead people because Fischl is overperforming in those calcs. So, sorry for being late, but as I promised months ago, I have new and more detailed calculations done with the help of gcsim using the new Kishing main standard rules. I don't like gcsim too much when specifically comparing teams, because if you aren't careful, you can easily get misleading results. But especially for Furina teams, I think it works perfectly because not only simplifies a lot very complex calculations, but also long simulations fit really well both with Neuvillette's steady and consistent damage profile and with Furina's 18 seconds buff duration, producing incredible DPS results which nicely reflect what you should expect from a normal gameplay. These are the results of the new calculations obtained using the updated caching main standards for gcsim, with the only exception of the Rainbow Taser team using a single extended rotation instead of 4, since it would have been too penalized otherwise, because of how Fischl works. Still, the team unsurprisingly performs much worse in these calcs, which is expected since the assumptions are now fairer. Looking at the other teams, the role of healers in Furina teams keeps proving quite complex. Why does the no-healer team compare so well, and why is Jin so underwhelming? Mainly, there are two reasons, and these are among the most important concepts in this video. 1. Neuvillette is extremely good at building fanfare stacks on his own. Even in a team with no healing, he almost halves and refills his health bar with his charge attacks. And thanks to Furina's healing bonus from her burst, he even manages to overheal himself, triggering a couple of times Furina's E1 passive, which provides some additional healing. Eventually, you start the third charge attack with the stacks almost maxed. Still, that might seem underwhelming. With a team-wide healer, after the first rotation, you would build stacks much faster than that. Generally, they would be already maxed at the start of your second charge attack. But there's a catch. 2. To boost fanfare stacks, the team-wide healing needs to happen after Furina's burst. So you need to swap to your healers and cast their skills before you can start blasting with the Hydro Pump. The healers steal Neuvillette's on-field time during the same buff they are meant to boost. But it's not just Furina's buff. Being forced to use a healer right after Furina's burst makes more difficult maximizing the uptime on your other buffs too. For example, the Jin team wastes uptime on the Petra buff you get early in the rotation, to the point that refreshing it mid-rotation is a valid option if you go for 4 charge attacks, even if it means wasting even more uptime during Furina's burst. Another issue that affects the calculations with Jin is that by lacking Kazuha, you have less uptime on a strong source of damage bonus, filling the downtime of your other buffs. And that hurts too, both in the calculations and in practice, because for players it's not unusual, for example, to need to finish a challenge after Furina's burst expired. So being more reliant on her burst translates in much less flexibility, and this is not spreadsheet impact, this is a real practical gameplay limitation. Actually, some might argue that these calculations are biased against healers because, in practice, good players with strong builds can clear Abyss Chambers much faster than a rotation with 4 charge attacks. Like 3 or even 2 if your investment is really high might be enough, and this is also why many speedrunners use characters like Child instead of Furina to begin with. So, they might say, a healer in a real gameplay will perform better because it builds stacks faster, front-loading Furina's buff. Front-loading Furina's buff. I've heard this many times. And you're in for a surprise with this. You see, at first it makes sense, but in reality this doesn't really translate in more front-loaded damage for 2 reasons. 1. Casting your healer's burst slows you down and you start blasting a bit later, losing the advantage. 2. Even if you skip Baizhu's burst, because with Baizhu you heal the team with the skill, not the burst, Zhongli still front-loads 35% damage bonus with Petra, and Baizhu's healing usually only 25-30%. So all things considered, if you compare the damage profiles, you see that there's not any relevant difference, and the front-load argument doesn't really hold. You want front-load for your speedrun? Play Vape, not Furina Double Hydro. I mean, you can speedrun with Furina, this is not the point. You don't get a lot of front-load in these teams. Vape is for front-load. And again, I already told you that simulations represent very nicely how Furina teams perform, because the damage profile they describe is more similar to what people actually play in real scenarios. You can use calculations for vape teams too, of course, but using them properly without being misleading, it's more difficult. It can be done, but it requires more finesse. By looking at the graph, and even better at this one, another glaring fact is that the gap between Prototype Ember and Tom decreases in the Furina team without healers. This is really interesting because it's thanks to the healing from Prototype Ember's passive. It helps you building stacks a bit faster, maxing them a couple of seconds earlier, and of course makes Furina's pets deal more damage by fulfilling their conditional buff, with a noticeable 7-8% damage increase, so actually a relevant margin. Also, let me brag a little because this is the exact value I got from my old calcs where I used different assumptions and I calculated this stuff by using coefficients obtained from some average values. And it's really interesting because I used much rougher methods to simplify the calcs and still managed to get a lot of stuff right, which is kinda cool, I guess, so I just wanted to point this out. While Prototype Ember's healing is very useful in the Furina team without healers, I can't say the same for teams with them. Apparently, when you combine strong team-wide healing, Proteb Ember and Furina's A1, the healing tends to be overkill and Furina might struggle to bring everyone back to around half HP for the next burst, preventing your healer from front-loading a lot of fanfare stacks and slowing down their generation. This is exactly what happens in this run with my level 50 Charlotte, which is really funny. And I finished chamber 2 after a full rotation, and when I use her burst again the next chamber, my teammates are still very healthy. This girl knows her job, she's good. On average, Furina's pets deplete the teammates' HP by almost 2.5% each second, needing in theory about 20 seconds to consume half HP, but in practice that's closer to 22 because they can drain during vulnerability frames. So even if you full heal your team once per rotation, Furina's drain would still be enough to bring everyone to 50% HP or close to that. But if you provide more healing over time, then even in 27/28 seconds rotations, like these ones, Furina will not drain fast enough. Of course, nerfing your healer isn't a solution, because you would also nerf your frontload, so don't do that. This anti-synergy might be not too relevant, like in this analysis you max fanfare stacks only about 1 second slower, but it's still an additional incentive for players with prototype to go for Furina teams without healer. And in teams with them, even if Neuvillette has a different weapon, I generally recommend to not give prototype Ember to your teammates, unless the healing isn't particularly strong, or unless your healer isn't used to front-load fanfare stacks. Huh. But what the f are you doing with a healer that doesn't front-load fanfare stacks? You play TCG with them? I don't know. I guess I can't avoid the topic anymore, so let's talk about what the hell is Baizhu doing in this rotation. After dozens of tests in the sim trying to optimize the rotation, I discovered that the best solution seems to be just slapping Baizhu at the beginning of it, so that for the reasons that I explained earlier, the uptime on the various buffs can be maximized. And I know this sounds crazy, and I don't think this is the most optimal rotation in all scenarios, but it clearly can be, and this is another proof of how overrated healing is for maximizing fanfare stacks in AoE teams. The benefit you get compared to the cost you pay for it is so underwhelming that the average damage in the sim is at least 3% better if you just throw Baizhu as far as possible from the other buffs. And also it helps a lot the fact that Baizhu gets particles from Neuvillette's first E. But even if you ignore energy requirements, the gap still exists. Which, if you think about how many players are convinced that front-loading fanfare stacks is crucial for Neuvillette Furina teams, it's kinda funny. By the way, the healing still helps getting some stacks from the team HP draining, but also keeps teammates above 50% health, allowing Furina to deal more damage, and also it can help triggering Furina's A1, which is additional healing, and that helps even more. So it's not like Baiju's healing is useless, just not as effective as you would think. In the end, what matters the most is the Furina Kazuha core, while both Zhongli and Baizhu are just amazing options for the first slot. Zhongli, even according to other theory crafters, is the superior one, but the margin is quite small, and I think that what matters for more players is how the two characters feel, ignoring their offensive ceiling. Defensively speaking, Baiju's shields are quite unreliable. They are paper thin, you are forced to use a burst to get them, and you only get 6, just 6 of them per rotation, and only every 2.5 seconds. While Zhongli has simply the best shield in the game with an amazing uptime and it doesn't need energy. It's true that I say that shields with C0 Neuvillette are overrated and I stand by that, I never use them. But it's also true that many players are less skilled or don't want to think too much about their positioning when they fight. Also, Neuvillette hasn't met yet the Constipated Beast in floor 12, and I have a feeling that a tanky shield against a bunch of them would actually feel pretty nice. About more in general comfort and ease of use, the comparison is less straightforward instead. On one hand, Zhongli's shield is amazingly comfortable, but looking for the Hydro Shard in order to activate the Petra buff can be annoying, especially when you are against a boss with a cringe hitbox and the shard randomly drops inside of it. It's not like losing Petra is a very big deal, you just lose about 5% in damage, but it still kinda sucks. On the other hand, Baiju's shield, while much less reliable, tends to be enough, and even though his energy requirements without C1 and without wasting time swapping to him twice are really high, what many don't mention is that you don't need to cast the burst. You can just use the skill and move on, saving the burst for those scenarios where you think you need interruption resistance. This way, energy problems disappear unless you need the burst twice, you increase the team's flexibility, and you also avoid risking to miss a Hydro Swirl because of the Dendro gauge eating the aura at the wrong time. It's rare, but it can happen. I know Baiju's banner is currently up and many of you want an opinion, so I'll be honest. I don't think Baizhu is worth your Primus if you just want him for Neuvillette. It's not just because I think Zhongli is better, even though he is marginally, but because in general the slot can be occupied by different characters just fine. When Furina came out, Baizhu was promoted from expensive comfort option for Dendro teams to versatile defensive character and excellence in certain quick bloom teams. If you want him to fulfill those Dendro roles, then getting him makes more sense, but if you want him just because a friend told you he's amazing with Neuvillette, honestly, I would think twice. Sure, he's a really good flex for the Neuvillette Furina Kazuha core, but he's not even the absolute best one, offensively nor defensively. He's just a great but replaceable option, and I don't say it just because I think Zhongli is marginally better, but because even Zhongli is a flex, and depending on the scenario and your investment, Zhongli technically isn't even the best offensive option. The dude has more competition than you think. In fact, Fischl's performance in single target is absolutely identical with that of Neuvillette, and if you use Prototype Member, then Fischl clearly beats Zhongli because a higher portion of your damage comes from her. You can call it free-to-play skill issue, I guess. I don't necessarily think that Fischl is strictly better than Zhongli overall, there are many things to consider, but certainly she's very competitive. By the way, if you are worried that your C0 Fischl isn't viable, don't worry. Sure, she loses 30% damage, but since she deals a minor fraction of your team damage, the overall damage loss is not even 10%, like 7-8 usually. Another very underrated flex, who just recently was reevaluated, also thanks to Jamie's work, is Lisa. Thanks to her death shred, even with garbage investment, she's basically identical to Zhongli, with no noticeable difference from an offensive standpoint. But because you need her burst and can't afford the time to hold her skill for particles, her energy requirements can easily become intergalactic. Giving her prototype helps a lot both her and the team, but even with the flat energy passive, the requirements are still very high, so if you are against energy poor chambers, you might be forced to skip her burst sometimes, at which point she's still viable, but use her in scenarios where you can afford to burst. Another interesting option worth mentioning is Charlotte. The lively ace reporter from Fontaine has a ton of front-loaded healing on her burst, and offensively speaking she's virtually as good as Baizhu with two main differences. First, her front-loaded cryo application prevents her from being used at the beginning of the rotation like I showed with Baizhu, because she would very likely eat the Hydro Aura before Kazuha can swirl it, so use her after Furina's burst like normal. Secondly, you need her burst in order to heal. Unlike Baiju's burst, which is a film, her animations are very fast, so the time isn't an issue. The problem is getting enough energy recharge without using her skill twice, which can be hard in energy-poor scenarios. These two things can make her feel a bit more annoying and less versatile compared to Baizhu, but the flip side is that she can give you the most comfortable reaction in the game: freeze. Of course, it's useless against bosses, but bosses are also easier to read and dodge, while being able to freeze whole waves of enemies is an amazing asset and arguably the most comfortable one, making Charlotte arguably the best flex. In the end, even if you don't have any of these options, don't forget that you can build very solid teams using free characters like Lynette and Geo Traveler who can fill the slots in most teams just fine. And most importantly, unless you are a very hardcore player, don't stress too much on videos like this one which tell you what are the absolute best teams. Play what is fun, not what is strong. And sure, destroy enemies can be fun for many, so a strong team in that case is also a really fun team. It's almost hard to not destroy enemies with Neuvillette. Neuvi is one of those characters that allows you to use basically whatever teammates you want and you would still clear Abyss blindfolded, so seriously, prioritize what's fun for you. And if, like me, you like trying weird combs and exploring unusual synergies, absolutely do that. The first time I tested Neuvillette in Abyss, I put him in some wacky Burgen/Burnev Delirium with Beidou catalyzing the Burgen reactions and providing interruption resistance. Then I played him with Petra Goru in a Freeze Abomination and with Nilo Bloom, and each time I've had a great time. So don't be afraid to test weird things. They even might actually work. So this is it for this video. Have fun, eat your veggies. Check out the description for the calculations and the resources used in this video and the comments for any future clarifications. Subscribe if you don't hate my voice, and don't hesitate to ask me any questions or to demolish my claims if you think I did some mistakes. Just beware because I tend to write a lot. Thank you very much for watching. See ya!